All right, next up we have Peter Wolf of Rogue Wolf Training out of Oregon. He'll be presenting 8 tips for Wushu athletes to address pain and mobility issues in their practice.
I think I'm on. Great. Thanks so much for having me. It's fun to be back again, part of this. So I'm covering 8 different tips, things that will overlap a little bit regarding your mobility. And we're going to try to cover how mobility can help you from rehabilitation all the way to performance or prehab. I think it's probably a little hard to read. I'm going to pull this up on the screen just a little bit. We'll revisit it. Maybe take a snapshot later. These are the 8 tips. We can put them up on the Facebook page. The first one is to do it daily. I'm going to give you an example of a daily mobility practice called the recharge. We've done before in these seminars. It takes about 10 minutes. Second tip is get on the floor. Take that pressure off of your joints, off of the usual sport positions. Get onto the floor is a good way to get a little more bang for your buck on your mobility. Number 3 and 4 go together. Isolate individual joints and then integrate patterns of movement, multiple joints at one time. Number 5 and 6 also go together. When it comes to stretching, there's a spectrum. We can move from suspending, think like a partner stretch or a band or a rope that's holding up your leg, all the way to a loaded stretch, 2 opposite ends of the spectrum, and how to use those suspended versus loaded. And then number 7 is going to be soft tissue. That's using like foam rollers, self-applied massage, or getting professional hands. Today is going to be an example of using the foam roller. And I'll grab a couple different tools that work for that. We'll spend 10, 15 minutes on the foam roller. And then number 8 is don't live in your sport. Don't live in your sport posture. And specifically how to kind of get out of that. I'm going to give you some examples from yin yoga, how to use some passive stretching. And we have a lot of active stretching in martial arts. And so the yin yoga is a way to address the soft tissue with some passive stuff. So we'll go from active to passive kind of efforts. You can join along or take notes. Maybe we can stop every 15 minutes or so if there's questions, or I'll look for it on the chat board too if questions pop up. So first bit is the recharge. I'm going to get myself into good posture, kind of broad across the collarbones, long from the head to the ribs, long from the ribs to the pelvis. I'm going to put my hands behind my back. I'm going to start with the neck and kind of move through every single major joint of the body, head to toe. I'm going to do about 10 to 15 repetitions. And while we're doing these, I'll do a lot of the reps with you, but I'm also going to point out a couple of these other extra tips that we can plug into all of the 8 things that we're doing, really, at least a little bit. So up and down to the neck. The very first one is be mindful about your breathing, and especially your exhalations. Use your inhale to guide you into a motion. Inhale into extension. Usually you're inhaling to initiate a stretch. And then the exhale can help tell you how far you can really go. When I run out of breath, usually I'm out of range of motion also. So we went up and down, we went side to side. We're going to start next to move into figure 8s and circles. This is step 1, daily mobility practice. Specifically, this one's called the daily recharge. It's a joint by joint approach. We're doing like 10 or 20 reps of each individual movement. And right now we're in the neck. I'm being mindful about the breathing. Next, I'm going to go into the wrists. I'm going to spread out the fingertips and clench the hands tight, tight fists, and then extend out the fingertips. I'll do that 10 or 20 times. I'll bring this up to the board later. And again, maybe a snapshot. So that first extra was be mindful about your breathing. We can do that all the time. Inhale into extension, exhale into tension or flexing. These next one, I call them the 3 S's of flexible steel. 3 S's are create space. Just try to make more space between individual joints, right? The individual joints within your fingertip or the major joints from elbow to wrist. Going to continue with the wrist, this time going up and down like we did the neck. Trying to create space is the first S. Second S, spread the load out. So that could mean fingertip to fingertip in the movement we're doing now, or more generally, spread out ribs to pelvis, spread out head to ribs, spread out the load. Going to go back and forth like we did through the neck 10, 20 times. So create space is the first S. Second S is spread the load. Third S is use strength, use a little bit of muscle. So we're going to go through now these finger fans, getting the knuckles of the wrists and the knuckles of the hands both, and just using a little bit of muscle on it You can use the 3 S's almost in any stretch pattern that we do today. Just create space, spread the load, use a little strength. I'm going through the elbows now, small circles in either direction. One of the big pieces of mobility that we won't be able to necessarily practice today, we can talk about, and at the last of the 15 minutes, maybe chat about, is nutrition and sleep. That is a big part of recovery from injury, a big part of your mobility. You just did those elbows. We're going to go into our shoulders next. I want you to hike the shoulders high and drop them low. So we won't get to necessarily model that, but for sure, extra sleep is a big deal. And I think too, giving your digestive system a bit of a break. So it's popular now to use like intermittent fasting, or just, again, to be real mindful about eating and how that influences your range of motion, how your joints feel, your inflammation. So I'm using forward and backward circles to the shoulders. Shoulders are our focal point now. We did our neck, we did our wrists, elbows, and just moving upstream into bigger joints. I'm twisting and reaching, like wringing out a towel. I can do that 10, 20 times. I'm being mindful about the breath. I'm trying to spread the load out and create space between my joints, trying to use a little bit of strength. Move next through your mid back. We're going to extend and flex through the mid back. A lot of times with your daily practice, whether it's the recharge or a bit of yoga, some warm-ups you like from your school, doing a daily practice also becomes a little bit of a checkup, like going to the doc. And you may notice way ahead of time problem areas, tight spots through the spine, tight spots in your ankle. You use your daily practice also as a checkup, not just as a warm-up before activities. I might even use my whole recharge on days that I didn't intend to work out, but just to check in with the joints, notice problem spots. Your recharge will inform you where we might want to spend more time on some of the other pieces, like the soft tissue work or doing some loaded or unloaded stretching. We were just moving laterally through the mid spine. Next, we're going to twist a little bit. I want you to try letting the legs soften just a little bit and feel that twist coming from your rib cage, and let your arms swing a little bit if it feels good. We're going to move downstream into the lumbar, pelvis, and hips, and then we'll go to the ankles, we'll go to the feet, and then we're going to move on to number 2 in our list of 8. So right now we're still on that do it daily. I want you to work from your lower back, pelvis, and hips, front to back a few times. Extend and flex, create more space, ribs to pelvis. Be mindful about your breathing. You can go side to side if we went front to back. And we can go corner to corner. That's not written on the list, but I should put that on there. I would be mindful about multi-planar stretching. We tend to stretch in one plane, front to back, and not get too coily or twisty. And it is recommended that you try to stretch in multiple planes of motion. We'll address that a little when we're on the floor, multi-planar stretching. We went front to back, side to side, corners, and circles. We're moving downstream into your knees. I want you to set your hips back and try to deeply flex into the knees, flex and extend 5 and 10 times. If it's okay for your knees, make some small circles. In my personal practice and personal experience, martial artists who last the longest, who can still play the game the longest, have a daily practice. They have a daily checkup with their body. So this is the recharge. We did about probably 25, 30 movements here. Just went from the knees now to the ankles. And just one example of what a daily practice might look like. Daily practice lubricates the joints. It brings a little bit of heat to tissue before doing something harder. And it might help you spot potential problems, imbalances between the right and left side bodies before they become injuries. So front to back, inside out, and circles too. That's a good way to try to target what it is you're trying to do, is get every joint to move every way. So think about extension and flexion and then rotation, and you'll have a lot of your bases covered. So I think you can find the recharge still on the YouTube page, and happy to put something up on that if people are interested, or creating your own version of the recharge. I'd be happy to take a look at that if you got questions, concerns about how to put together a daily joint practice. So we're going to move on to number 2. We're going to get on the floor. Getting on the floor has all kinds of benefits. And number 1, I'm going to tilt just a little bit, see if we can see better the floor. It allows us to unload the way that the joints are usually loaded. So get to kind of start from square one. So especially useful if you're coming off injury. I'm headed to the floor in a prone position. This is what an infant might call tummy time. There's very little effort going on, but there's a little bit of efforting just to breathe in this position because the floor is in the way of really expanding through the low belly. This is sometimes called crocodile breathing, prone breathing. So we're going to be here for just 1 minute. And this is moving into the second stage, which is get on the floor to increase mobility in a safe way. We want to make the body feel really safe before we start to stretch it. Sometimes what inhibits your range of motion is not the injury itself, but the body's memory of the injury. It's guarded around that range of motion. And so this is a way to get kind of unguarded, a little bit reset, relaxed around your spine, deep, slow breathing. I'm going to use the crocodile breathing, and then I'm going to start to go into some different isolated stretches and then some integrated stretches. So we're going to start to play with those 3 and 4 of our 8 tools, isolated and integrated. I'm going to isolate a stretch from my quadricep by reaching back and making a grab for my foot. If that grab was not available, then you might extend your spine a little more. That's pushing on this lead arms for a little help. Or you could use a strap, a belt, a rope, and cover the distance that way. So I'm going to hold the stretch right now for about 2 to 4 seconds. And then I'm going to trade sides. And I'm going to continue to do that. I'm going to start that 2 to 4 second clock once I establish my position. I'm mindful about the stretch I'm feeling. So I'm no rush. That 2 to 4 seconds might start to get a little faster as the stretch becomes more predictable. I'd like to get a good stretch into the front thigh, quadriceps. I'm targeting my heel to my buttocks without having to extend the spine too much. So I'm isolating mostly. While we're here, we can talk some other tactics. Some of the tactics you can use in almost any stretch is contracting and relaxing. So if you've made that grab, I'm going to try first contracting the quadricep muscle as if to kick my leg to straight. If I didn't have my arm in the way, I could kick my leg to straight. So I'm going to contract against the stretch and then relax. Contract and relax. When you do contract, relax, you're not trying to make maximal efforts in your contraction. And it may pay off to do 3 to 5 or more efforts within a single stretch, contracting for 2 to 4 seconds and relaxing for 2 to 4 seconds, treating it almost like repetitions of an exercise lift. And you see, for me, I got a little more range out of that. That let go some on that side. There's another way to contract and relax, still within the same isolated stretch. You can also contract an antagonist, the opposite of the muscle that you're trying to stretch. So I'm isolating a stretch on my quad, my front thigh. If I tighten up the glute, if I squeeze my butt and hamstring, that also will affect the stretch. And I can contract and relax the antagonist muscle as opposed to the synergist or the targeted muscle and the muscles around it. So both of those tactics will work. You will start to turn your stretching into a little bit of a workout. For sure, it takes more time. I wouldn't necessarily do contract, relax every single day or on every single stretch, but it's a useful tactic for injury prevention and also injury rehabilitation. So now we're going to integrate a little bit. We did a lot of isolating. To integrate what we were just stretching, instead of isolating our quadricep and just moving through the knee there, we're going to go up, flex the ankle, pulling toes towards knee, and come over like a little scorpion's tail. Let's see if I can move so I'm not in the way of my dry erase board there. So I'm going to leave my arms a little wide so I'm less extended in the spine. If that's comfortable for you, you can do this more extended in the spine. Going to come up and over. I'm still using that 2 to 4 seconds as a guide, or maybe use 1 breath per side. Now the stretch is integrated, and it's no longer just about the quadricep. Now there's a whole bunch of muscles being asked to extend and lengthen as I integrate the stretch. So I want you to always think about when you're stretching, there's a lot of ways to stretch, and they're not wrong. It just depends. What's your intention? Your intention can really change what you get out of your stretch. So we were talking about using isolated and integrated techniques now from the floor specifically, but isolated and integrated can work all over the place, right? You can isolate the wrist and then integrate full shoulder circles with, some wrist movement. When you've got a restriction in your range of motion, it's useful to start looking isolated first and kind of see maybe where the restriction is. And then quickly you want to be working back towards some integrated movement. So isolated versus integrated, we're going to continue to use some examples of that as we go. Let's try an example, since that was good for our quads. Let's try an example that's going to be a little more for the posterior. We're going to stay on the floor. So again, the good reason to be on the floor is to unload the way that your joints are normally loaded and potentially get past guarded habits, basically habits that come from being in your sport position. Getting onto the floor is like a reset button to address your range of motion. So I'm going into a tall seated position now, and I'm going to use another frame that we've used before in our seminars. This is called a shin box series. Different modalities use it in different ways. I've got my knees bent about 90 degrees. And I've got my ankles flexed. I'm pulling toes to nose, dorsiflex, and trying to rotate mostly from my hips here. I'm keeping the spine relatively still. The pelvis, lumbar, hips, rotating back and forth. I'm going to go slowly from more isolated to more integrated, kind of back and forth. I'm going to use some contract and relax. And then we're going to start to talk about how to use loaded versus suspended in some different shapes. So first, to integrate, I'm going to take my one arm free and now let the whole spine twist through here. Where before it was just the lower body, now I'm letting the whole spine get involved. We didn't break it down yet. This would be another one I want to write down before we're done. In all of your stretching, you can use more active or more passive. Without getting too fancy, it's mostly a little faster, a little slower, holding longer, not as long, right? We can talk about different ways to do this. Mostly I'm staying at that 2 to 4 second active pace. And now that was integrated. I'm going to isolate again for a moment. So I'm going to isolate some external hip rotation from this shape. I'm going to try to lift this leg like it's a drawbridge. And this is going to be, for a lot of people, some efforting in the muscles to get that to lift or move at all. If it's very easy for you, try it without suspension. I'll show you what that looks like. So using your arm for support, if I take the arm support away and try to do the same lift, holding the torso relatively still, it's a little more work than using a little bit of suspension. So this is starting to get into principles of 5 and 6, using suspension or loading a stretch. You can go in 2 different directions to make things challenging or to make things accessible. So to make the stretch accessible, I may need to put both arms into the floor, have a lot of suspension, and just slowly go for that isolated lift. Other side of the coin, you could choose to load the stretch. Now, I'm going to show you what that might look like with, and my example is going to be with a kettlebell. You could load your stretch. Other nice tools, sandbag, dumbbell, lots of ways we can load a stretch potentially. So loading it up forces the issue a little bit around my posture and some of the core muscles. And I still can isolate or integrate, come back to the integrated version back and forth, but now loaded versus the both hands like tent poles suspended. So when we're looking at injury, this is a good way to start with suspension allow there to be safety and see what a good range of motion, what's kind of possible. And then moving along that from suspended to potentially loaded, and then loading it different ways. Other great ways to use suspension, partner stretches. I want to go into another series, another kind of uniform shape, since we got in that one some good stuff for the posterior hips in our shin box. We're going to go into another good archetype, a half kneeling shape, and talk a little bit more about suspended versus loaded. And then we'll slide into soft tissue work, I think, before we get to halfway. Perfect. About 22 minutes in. So the next series is going to come from half kneeling. We're going to split the hips, and we're going to try to use all of these techniques, isolate and integrate, suspend and load, and then we'll do both sides, build a little complex out of it. The half kneeling shape, I got one leg forward, one leg down. I'm trying to lengthen or tuck the tailbone to get into a more neutral pelvis. It's going to feel like the hips are trying to extend forward in space. So this is pretty isolated right now. And if we held it for 20 to 30 seconds, that would be our more passive or static hold. That's a good way just to establish what's the shape of the stretch. Active, I can move in and out of it. Can be trying to contract the glutes, back and forth. A more integrated movement would drive us out of this shape. So, for example, just drive out and up into balance and then return down into the shape. Back and forth could be a dynamic version of that, or more, even more active version. Right now, I'm going to suspend it in a couple different ways, the stretch, and then load it in a couple different ways. For suspension, I've got this rack behind me, and you don't need anything fancy. You can use a rope, literally, old tie around back of a tree. But I've got these straps for my hands. I'm walking myself forward into the stretch, and it's suspending my body weight. The straps now are probably holding 20, 30% of my weight and allows me to dip into a deeper stretch. I can continue to use some contract and relax, contracting the glutes and relaxing, or trying to flex my front thigh as if to drive the knee forward in space and relax. Suspension could also happen in the form, we'll do a couple more reps here, suspended and on both sides. A partner is also a great way to suspend a stretch. So imagine one or two partners holding your arms behind your back, could drive you into the stretch. Definitely counts as suspension. You might be already using a lot of these tactics in your stretching, and we can find more in different ways to make it work if you're training on your own, training at home. So I'm going to suspend again, but in a different way. I'm going to use 2 yoga blocks. And I'm going to talk a little bit again about isolated and integrated, using some more of our tools. So this is suspended again for the same position, half kneeling stretch. I'm going to start to make it a little more integrated by adding an extension forward of one leg and backwards of the other. So more like a gentle split, suspended split. And then I'm going to keep it active by going back and forth between the two sides every 2 to 3, 4 seconds. If you were on like some sliders, you got some socks on right now, works pretty good for something like this. You can use contract and relax, try to pinch through your inner legs, relax, squeeze tight through the inner legs, relax. Use your breathing. Should be able to get long exhalations, prioritize that exhale. So another way to suspend, I suspended from above, pulling me up, and then I suspended from below, pushing down. 2 examples of suspension, still using that same frame, half kneeling, and moving from integrated to isolated to integrated, back and forth. We're on the floor, so you get to unload the joints a little bit differently. We did the joint checkup first. I'd recommend that you do, before doing some of this more intense stretching, do the daily recharge, do your daily routine, or do the soft tissue work that we're going to do after this. So I'm going to do just a little bit of loaded now. For the loaded stretch, half kneeling, this could again be like a sandbag. This could be dumbbell, kettlebell. I'm going to use my kettlebell and have it kind of be pulling me slightly downward, forcing me to fight against that. Open up the stretch. You could also load from behind the body. Let's pull in my posture, giving some of those muscles a little extra work to do. I'm going to try that through both sides. I'm keeping it active still, 2 to 4 seconds. I'm changing position. I'm trying to be mindful about the breath. Still using those 3 S's. Create space, spread the load, use some strength. And again, it plays through the integrated movements too. I might use like this as a overhead load, centered load into the splits. There is another good tool. I know in one of our earlier seminars, there was some good examples of how to use tubing and banding. And banding is interesting because it kind of is a bit of a hybrid between suspension and also load. I'm going to use a medium band, and this is all relative, right? The strength of it, but this is not so light, not so heavy. I'm going to use a medium band, and I'm going to load that same position up, the half kneeling stretch, but this one's a little tricky. It's a little bit of suspension and a little bit of load as well. So I've wrapped the band around my right hip. I'm wearing it high up on the inner leg, and I'm taking that leg backwards into the half kneeling stretch. And that gives me something to fight against. It forces the muscles of the posterior to fire up pretty strong. And so that's kind of loaded, but it's also pulling like a partner and suspending the joint, giving me a lot of space, ribs to pelvis. Like, it feels good to lengthen out that side body, some of the positions you might get into, like in your weapon stuff. And it also makes safer in some ways going for some of the deeper stretching. It's got a little bit of suspension and forcing some of the right muscles to fire. So banding is a great tool if you don't have available partner stretching, because partner stretching also, you can very quickly go from suspended or helping unload to resisting your partner and going back and forth. So that checks a lot of the boxes. I want to slide now into soft tissue. And then into that last principle of not living in your sport. I think it's especially true if you're doing a lot of weapons training or like in the combative arts, like in Sanda, you end up kind of living in that forward flex posture. So we'll talk about ways around that. And then maybe be able to open up some questions about how to, with the tools that you have available to you, how to create suspension and load in your stretching, and also maybe what does isolated versus integrated really look like. So we're headed into soft tissue. I'm going to grab a foam roller. I think that's the most popular, easy access tool right now for soft tissue work. The other end of the spectrum would be getting some professional hands on you daily. There are variations that vibrate, variations that heat up, cool down. They've got knobs on them, different tackiness to grab at your tissue in different ways. All probably have a good argument, for all the different kinds. And I would just recommend finding stuff that you can use on the regular. It's certainly nice if you can travel with it, take it to class and back, your massage tool. And some areas are just harder to hit than others. So I'm going to work from the floor, at least to start, and then we can troubleshoot if there's questions about how to make this work from standing, how to make this work in an office or something. I've got more than a few toys we can bust out. So I'm going to start from the ground up. And there's one exception here. We're skipping the feet. So let me just address the feet real quick before we go up. Use a tennis ball, racquetball is a great tool. 30 to 90 seconds massaging around the arches of the feet is a great idea. Individually massaging the toes, also a great idea. Get a super friend to do it for you. Massaging the feet is for sure a big deal. We're going to skip the feet, but let's assume we could have massaged the feet for 30 to 90 seconds. We're going to move up to the next high target area, the calves, back of the legs, ankles. I've got my right leg on the roller. My first target is the bottom third of the leg. I'm going to spend the next maybe 5 and 10 minutes working on the lower body. In martial arts generally, and for sure in competitive wushu forms, Taolu, you've got a heavy use of the legs. And so we're starting with the legs and working our way up. I'm on the lower leg, the bottom third of it, and I'm looking for points that feel tender against the pressure of the roller. Some of this depends on the density of your roller, personal tolerance, whether it's got the knobs and stuff on it. But you're looking for a tender point or trigger. Once you find one, you're going to try to relax, not fight against it, kind of melt into it. I'm going to add compression by putting one leg on top of the other. So again, some tools already have compression, like the Theragun or some of the stuff that'll hit you. Massage tools are using some compression already. I'm using one leg on the other to create some compression. Now I'm going to start to use a little bit of cross friction. I'm tacked down on the trigger point. There's pressure on it. And then I'm shaking back and forth. So it's stretching it back and forth like it would my shirt here. Just imagine that inner sheath is moving back and forth. This is your fascia getting mobilized. This is not your muscles getting stretched, but it's equally important. It returns elasticity to the body. It's a way to hydrate your tissues. I went back and forth with the cross friction, and now I'm making some circular patterns. You either want to move the tissue this way by tacking it down the trigger point and moving around it, or move the associated joint. So in this case, the tissue that I'm on here in the lower leg, associated with the ankle, I'm going to go front to back, inside out, and make circles with the ankle. That's the other way to mobilize this tissue. And it's probably not going to feel great. It might be a little sensitive, we say in trainer speak, just short of painful. Don't chase pain. We're never chasing pain. I slide up my leg. I'm going to move into the middle quadrant now. We're on the lower quadrant and the middle quadrant. Use your breath to help you tell the difference. If you can take those big, slow, long exhales, if you can breathe through your nose, we're probably okay. Don't chase pain, but do chase feedback. I'm using that same cross friction. I found a trigger on the soft tissue about one more third up the lower leg. So I broke the lower leg into 3 quadrants, lower, middle, and higher. I'm looking for trigger points at each of the quadrants, inside or outside. When I find a trigger, I'm trying to relax and not fight back against it. And then maybe give it a little bit of shimmy shake, the cross friction, the transverse circles, or move the associated joint, the ankle, and in this case, also the knee. Now as we move up our calf a little bit. Last quadrant, sliding up a little higher still, inward and outward. I'm finding, there's a trigger. I'll compress on it with the other leg. Mostly you're looking for the sensitive spot to be a little less sensitive. And that's hard to put your finger on sometimes. Sometimes it's obvious. It could be a 7 out of 10, yikes, when you start. I'm going to move to the other leg. And it could be like a 5 when you finish, right? That there's an obvious change. Sometimes the change is less obvious. If the tissue is very healthy and hydrated, it may release almost immediately. Like, there's a little trigger, it's gone. If it's been there a while, you could spend 30 to 90 seconds and barely make a difference. The caveat with this kind of massage training, there's lots of different versions of it, and some are more intense than others. Like I say, don't chase pain. And if nothing feels better, if it doesn't feel better after 90 seconds, a little less sensitive, but it actually feels worse, then let's not bark up that tree, not do more and more. It's not feeling a little less sensitive within 30 to 90 seconds, then maybe we don't use this technique as much. So I spent a lot of time on the calves there. I was getting released usually within 15 to 30 seconds. Nothing's too bad. I'm going to move upstream. I'm going to look through the legs. And again, so the legs are such a big deal for Wushu, I'm going to spend a little extra time there. We're going to go posterior hip, anterior hip, where I think everyone would find something. And then also through the inside leg, just a little bit. We hit 3 spots. Then we're going to hit the lats for the upper body, and maybe just make our upper body trip pretty short, and then talk about how to not live in your sport. I'm going to sit tall on the roller for this next one. I'm going to shift my weight into the target area, which for me is the left hip. I'm going to expose the left hip a little bit to the massage by flexing and then rotating the hip. So I'm kind of in a figure 4 position tall, and I'm sitting my weight into that hip. Once I find my trigger, I'm going to relax into it. When you're doing soft tissue work, remember the soft part. We're not trying to roll on bony tissue. We're not trying to press on hard surfaces. We're trying to press on soft surfaces. and resist contracting against them. Sometimes you don't even know that you're guarded or contracting against a massage, against the trigger point. So you can use some of the stuff we did earlier, contract and relax, to tell the difference. You can intentionally contract and then relax your glute in this example to know if you were maybe guarded a little bit. Maybe there's some tension there that you didn't realize. Moving the associated joint might look like this in this one: inward, outward rotation of the hip, or even extending and flexing back the whole entire leg. I'm going to spend just a couple breaths further. And then let's stay on the same leg to get the principles, and then we'll repeat the same series for the other leg. This was posterior hip. Now I'm going to go anterior hip. So front pocket, back pocket is a way to think of it. We just did the back pocket. Now we're going to do your front pocket. This is the hip flexors and into the quadriceps. And for almost any Chinese martial artist, you're probably going to have some stuff here. This is one of those, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you work out a lot, this area will get quite tight, congested. And if you sit a lot, it will also get quite tight and congested. And for some of us, we might end up doing both of those things, working out a lot and sitting a lot. So I'm on my front pocket. I'm in a plank position. My elbows are right below my shoulders, stacked, strong. So it's not too much effort to hold the position. It's still some effort to hold the position. Abs on tight. If you've done the plank exercise for strength before, it's exactly the same. You get a 2-for-1 here. Once I find the trigger, the tender point, I can use the cross friction, moving back and forth. And that's going to be like trying to tune a piano. It's a lot of small individual stuff can be going on. You can try moving the joint inward and outward rotation of the hip, or the knee is also associated joint here with this complex. If I bend my knee, it also changes the feedback quite a lot. I'm going to spend about a couple breaths further. It feels a little better than when I started. Now, don't expect it to go away completely. If your trigger point was a 5 out of 10 when you started and it goes to 4 out of 10, that's a great success. Wouldn't expect it to go to a 0 necessarily. Once you get a little bit of release, it's worth it just to move on to the next spot. You don't need to continue and work for more and more complete release. Usually one little bit of change is the best you might get in one single sitting. Best way to use your soft tissue work is often. Use it daily is the best way, but using it before your workout is really ideal. And then second to that, I would say post-workout, but using it both is also not bad. Just like we had 3 quadrants for the calf, I think of 3 quadrants for my quadricep: upper, middle, and lower. And again, maybe one's got more going on than the other. You can hang out there longer. I'm going to stay affecting the same leg. We did posterior and we did anterior, front pockets, back pockets. We did lower with the calf, and now we're going to work into the inside upper. Okay. So I'm going to go for inside of the same leg. I'm still in the plank position. I bent my knee to about 90 degrees. So it's kind of in line with the hip. Got a little wiggle room there. And I'm going to work through the inner seam of the leg. Consider there to be a high, middle, and a low again. So closest to the knee, in the middle, and then closest to the groins. And if you find a trigger, you can use cross friction. Now, because of the alignment of our leg, it's perpendicular to our spine now. Cross friction is up and down instead of side to side. Cross friction will look a little different. The associated joint would be your hip, inward and outward rotating, or your knee, or both. Try rotating the hip and knee. So we can be active here with our soft tissue work. Want to demonstrate the other side for those 3 spots. So kind of skipping the lower leg, and then I want to hit the lats as well before we're done. Let's see in the chat. Cool. Okay. So I'm going to go to seated on the other side and just kind of work about 30 seconds per spot. And then we'll still have some time to get into the don't live in your sport. So back pockets is the glutes, glute medius. I'm looking for the trigger by going inside and outside. Oh, found a trigger. So I'll settle, relax, and don't fight against it. I'm going to prioritize the exhalation. I might use contract and relax. Contract, relax the glute to try to search for any leftover tension, unnecessary tension. And then cross friction or circle. That's for the moving the actual skin suit, right? Moving your tissue. Then you can move the joint, the bony surfaces too, inward and outward. You don't need to be perfectly still. What I wouldn't recommend, what I see a lot with the foam roller, what I don't recommend is just going up and down real fast, big swipes. You want to go slow, mindful, look for those triggers and stay on the triggers. So like this stuff, moving back and forth quickly, I don't think as useful as going slow, finding your trigger, relaxing against it, and then get some slow rhythmic movement. Either move the tissue, like this cross friction here, or move the associated joint. Think about using contract and relax. And think about transverse or circular movement. Soft tissue can work really nice right before doing some more active stretching. It also plays really nice right before doing some passive stretching. That's how we're going to use it here at the end. I'm going for the inner leg quadrant next, and that's kind of fast. 30 to 90 seconds is reasonable. You don't necessarily need to look at every quadrant every time. Be real slick if you had a journal and you kind of indicated to yourself where you tend to get tight the most, right? That'll save you a lot of time when you're using the foam roller if you know where to go. Like right inner thigh, boom. I know that's a traditional area for me I need to address. Personally, what happens sometimes, I'm feeling really good. The whole body's feeling good head to toe, and I forget all about soft tissue work. You only think of doing it when you're hurt. So one big recommendation is do the soft tissue work all the time. It's good for checking in and staying injury-free, not just for treating an existing injury. You can use it preventative. All of this stuff is better actually preventative than after the fact, right? So want to use now some longer held stretches. We did our first 7 concepts. Do it daily. Do it daily. Get on the floor. Isolate individual joints and integrate joint movement or patterns. Use suspended and loaded stretching. You can use bands. You can use kettlebells, sandbags. Use a partner. Use ropes to suspend. Get some soft tissue works. Professional hands or partners, or using the foam rollers. And then don't live in your sport is the last one. And this also applies. It's like don't live in your working condition either. So again, for a lot of us who have to be seated for work or driving a lot, commuting a lot, to break out of that posture. Just getting on the ground a lot is already going to solve that for a lot of people. It gets you out of being in a poor posture and forces you to start looking at moving in order to be able just to breathe and be comfortable. So it's not so much that sitting is bad, but sitting in a comfortable chair. Maybe that's the bigger problem. So I want to move into some of these yin stretches now, these longer holds. And I'm going to start with what they would call a dragonfly. This one's pretty big carryover into Chinese martial arts. So this is just a wide angled pose. In yin yoga, they call it a dragonfly. And it's a good way to not live in your sport. We're going to hold for like 3 to 5 minutes. I'm going to show you a few different things to do within this shape. But the big thing is just to be here. There's really nothing else you have to do. So this one plays nice. If you've got some midterm papers to write, you can be in the dragonfly while you do it. If you're binging on some wushu videos, you can just be in the dragonfly. But you're not trying to get anywhere. You're not going to use so much contract, relax. We're not going to use weighted or suspended so much. We're just going to have a little bit of stress on the soft tissue. So inner leg, maybe your spine, and you can bend your knees as much as you need to. You can even sit on a bolster or a chair if this is or a seat, pillow if this is uncomfortable. You could have your hands behind you or in front, but to be very effortless in it is what it will allow us to stay for the 3 to 5 minutes. And in the same way we stress our muscles and they come back stronger, stressing your connecting tissue will help it come back stronger. So I just want a little bit of stress on it. Doesn't need to be an intense muscular stretch. The big deal would be just to be here. There's not even a particular special kind of breathing you need to do, just deep and rhythmic. I'm going to add a few ingredients to the position. And I would say this is, again, a high yield position, good ROI, return on your investment for Wushu, but you could be using all kinds of positions for your yin stuff. Another great one would just be in the crocodile breath or cobra position. We were on our belly earlier in the hour. That's another one where you're getting to lengthen the front of your spine and that tissue, and for sure you can stay for long periods of time. So I'm going to add to this a little gentle twist. As I twist towards what is my right leg, I'm using my left arm to push away from the floor a little bit. So I'm just affecting this side a little more, but I'm not using a lot of muscular effort. It's pretty passive. It's helping me take up my 5 minutes, but again, you wouldn't have to add or change anything at all if you were lightly stressing the area that we're after. The hard part about doing the yin style stretching is just making the habit. It really could be done in the morning or the night. It can be done independent of your workout, or it can be a nice finisher for a workout. I'm going to add another piece or two here, and then might open it up to see if there's any questions or options here. So now I'm just adding some lateral flexion. That's what we didn't get to do on the roller. That might have been nice, is to foam roll around the lats. That's a big deal anytime you're, especially using weapons and apparatus, connects your apparatus to your body. So that one can get pretty tight. I know previously in some of our seminars, I had a series we used a few times called the rib pull. That's a great way to work a little more on your upper body. You can use your mobility programming similar to how you might use strength programming. Have an upper body focus and a lower body focus, or have a light day, a heavy day, and a medium day. To try to, they're not so different. You're building mobility and you're building strength. They're just, part of the same process, really. If you load up some of your stretches, that plays really nice on a strength training day. Happy to talk about different examples, different ways to load or suspend stretches, different resources you might use. Some of my favorite resources have been flexible steel. There's some books, videos, and a certification training method around that. I think one of the really useful tools is the foam roller, but there's so many different ways to use that. The big deal, I think, is to use it consistently. But the exact how on some of those different massage tools is definitely worth investigating. Looking into recovery, sleeping more, getting in the right electrolytes, that's a really big deal, especially if you are in a weight class for your sport. I know that can affect somebody's mobility really quickly when they have to dramatically change weight, and making sure that you're staying hydrated and having the proper electrolytes in your system when you're reducing calories. That can be a big deal. When the training goes up and inflammation goes up, we can't always expect that our flexibility is also going to go up when you add extra stress. And so it's also a good tactic to have to schedule your mobility. Like, okay, you just got finished with a competition, use the next 3-4 weeks to focus specifically on targeted mobility. Because when you get into doing more and more reps, like of your Taolu, or you're doing more and more sparring, I wouldn't expect your mobility to go up when you add the extra training and the extra stress. It might actually go down a little bit. So it's nice to have a little extra mobility in the bank, like before you go into heavier training cycles. These are some bigger things to think about outside of just, putting in the time and doing the movement for stretches, how you're sleeping, how you're eating, and then how you're planning out your training season. I'll hang out a little bit, see if there's any questions, concerns, stuff you want to practice. I recommend some sort of suspension tool. I like these TRX suspension system is great, but there's other models, and really you don't need but a good rope, safety rope, climbing rope, something kind of sturdy. It works pretty good. I recommended flexible steel. I want to recommend kinetic stretching, or functional range training. Their system's really good. FRC, functional range conditioning. They'll do a lot of really good isolation stuff, like that shape we were in when we were doing the shin box. Like they've got cool stuff where you'd be trying to, like, really good for kicks, right? Like they'll be trying to isolate internal rotation of the leg. Like, if I got over the block, then have a target, try to get over 2 blocks. We were doing that external isolation, right? But you can do both internal and external, use different support or less support, just to be real intentional with the way that you're stretching. It's an easy thing to skip. It's an easy thing to be like talking and not thinking about your breath. It's an easy thing to do only when you're hurt or sore, when really we want it to be more preventative. Your mobility practice should be more of a prehabilitation than a rehabilitation if we can help it. And I know from my personal training, like getting on the soft tissue work, making sure I get massage in is a big, big deal. Yeah. And again, just to reiterate, like the people that I know that have the longest practices, that have been doing it the most and doing it well, have that daily, just almost robotic, like joint by joint checkup. And in different sports, from gymnastics to high level Brazilian jiu-jitsu, being around very high level rhythm gymnastics when training in China, like the basics never die. That's part of it. You just got to find a way to make it part of the lifestyle, not make it too demanding on your body to do some of the daily practice. So I'm not talking about necessarily doing all your jumps every day, right? Or your hardest tricks every day, but doing the joint check-in every day, that's definitely worthwhile. See how we're doing on time. Yeah, just a minute or two left, it looks like. Check if there's anything in the chat and maybe just review one more time what we covered.
Peter, I have a question.
Yeah.
Peter, it's Brandon.
I hear.
The box position you were showing before.
Shin box.
Yeah. Shin box. I remember when I started trying to get into that position, I was actually surprised at how difficult it was for me to hold a position without support. I would work around it by either using a yoga block, or I'd position myself near a wall so I could like put one arm on the wall. For anybody out there who might be trying to get into this position, especially moving from side to side, are there any other tips you might have where just simply being in the position is difficult?
Yep. So being on a riser, like a big, like a basketball could do it, or a big kind of sofa cushion. So see, now I'm tall seated, right? And it's way easier now to get these rotations going back and forth, because I've suspended up my by a couple inches my height. So that could be a tactic, even sitting on top of just a couple of pillows stacked, or something bigger could be a trick. Also, just holding one part of the position. I wish I had like a little sofa out here, but imagine this to be a bit of a chair. Like you could just sit into this part of the position, or a tabletop if you had the right table, and be in that external rotation, what yoga calls like a pigeon, and just groove like one part of it for a while would make it more and more accessible. But being on top of something, like sitting on top of something, will make it a little easier to go back and forth in that rotation. Using your hands behind you will help a little bit. And then maybe isolating just one part of it. Like I said, this works good. Imagine me here. There's a table or a right size bench. I'm just kind of putting your leg on it or in it. Real slick if you have like a slanted bench you can use too, or pile up the pillows just right. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, man.
Yeah, some of this stuff is weird. So to really isolate it, like I know that hip rotation is a big deal for wushu, and a lot of times one hip gets really stuck or impinged, and all of a sudden you've got back problems and they're coming from your hip. So just to get you another idea here, I'm using the band and I'm going to slide it up high again on the hip. So there's some resistance. And this is that hybrid where it is resistance, it's pulling on me, but it's suspending the joint and making it easier to get into this rotation because it's pulling on it. So this would be just only one little part of the shin box, right, that I can address, but or even that lift and kick out part. But it makes that part of it easier. And then I have to kind of do the work to get out of it, come back again. If we had more time and, we got into some maybe of some exercises to do for mobility, I would say these hip rotator ones are great. You see this in some different styles. Chin stretch and Pilates will use different versions of this, but this kind of work, because what's limited for you in that shin box position is internal and external hip rotation. And so if we get isolated rotation and get that grooving pretty good, then your integrated might go better, right? And same for a lot of stuff. If my shoulder's having some issues and I isolate like mid-spine and then reintegrate the whole shoulder, a lot of times that frees it up. So think of this at scale, isolated to integrated, moving up and down the scale to find what's right for you. And then also that loaded to suspended, like what's right for you. The other big variables are your volume, like how much time and repetition are you going to do? And I think having a lighter, heavier, and medium day throughout the week, your training week, makes good sense. Just like you wouldn't strength train exactly the same way every single time, your stretching doesn't need to be exactly the same intensity all the time. But there should be some sort of daily practice. I like flows, starting with a certain frame and then building into maybe more stretching depending on what I find, like what I feel during one part of it. So that shin box could be an example. Start with the basic back and forth, feels a little sticky. Then maybe go on, play Sherlock Holmes, do a little isolation, go back and integrate. On the days that you don't have time for all that, you make a note, like right hip's a little tight, want to address it before it starts to become a big problem. You don't want to be 6 weeks later and say, I remember that right hip was really bugging me. So preventative, right? Use your stretching routine as a way to catch what might be a problem that's building up before it becomes a problem. Thank you so much for your time, guys. It's super fun to participate again. I want to salute you out, tall kneeling shape.
Well, thanks a lot, Peter.
Right? Yeah, thank you. See if I can check in later in the day. I got a dance recital to go to next. Hope it's nice where you're at. We got the Smoky right now here in Southern Oregon. But enjoy the summer and keep practicing any which way that we can.